and perhaps future episodes of the same genre will be called Sidelights episodes, wherein we discuss associated topics, sometimes background to positive perspectives as a whole, as our group, but mostly we'd like to go back and pick the gleanings that we left behind from our main narrative, right? So there's many things that we try and weave into our narrative as we go through our different authors and try and make a cohesive theme so that you can follow along clearly. However, in doing so, we miss some of the points that authors do make, whether they're side points or just maybe not quite in alignment with what we're trying to say, or maybe we've misrepresented things in the past. I wouldn't say, maybe that's another good reason, right, why we might go back and clarify some things. So anyways, this week we'll be clarifying and working through the material from the last 3 weeks, as well as maybe talking a little bit about the future.
Yeah, or just things that have been on our minds, things that
Sidelights
to us seemed to be somewhat too sundry to talk about in the broader scope of the narrative, but also were interesting in that there were little thought bubbles that came up as we were digging into these topics.
Yeah.
And we did more research. I know I, for one, had a completely changed perspective when I did some research on some stuff we were discussing last time.
So this will be an even more casual conversation than before, as you can already tell by our F4 confirmation.
Indeed. Yes. So the first thing that was on my mind was about fragments from Heraclitus. And I considered, how does someone take textual knowledge or textual findings from over 1,000+ years ago, find them, parse them out, decide that they are from a certain author, and then attribute them to that author, but not only that, put them together in a translation of possible translations of the original writing itself.
Yeah.
Like I don't know if we have anything that Heraclitus actually touched with his hands.
Right. The original autographa.
Supposedly we have, sundry things that claim to be taken copies, I guess, from the original.
Well, it's tricky, too, because some of these really ancient authors are primarily verbal. Like, they don't necessarily write for themselves either. For instance, Socrates was like that. We don't have any of his actual writings or copies of his actual writings because he didn't seem to have any books like Plato had books, No. So Heraclitus could have been the same way, right? These fragments, maybe someone was just listening to him and, writing it down. Or maybe they, listened to him and ruminated on it for 40 years, and then after Heraclitus died, he was like, man, he said some interesting things, I should write that down. And so it's like, that you're completely correct. They could be very removed. And this is just the first step, right? As far as manuscripts are concerned, there could have been copies of copies of copies of copies, and then maybe we have those copies, right? And there could have been several errors introduced along that way. The way that works effectively is we use scientific dating methods in order to identify which copies of this text, which fragments are oldest, and we examine, or not just the oldest ones, we identify the ages of all of them, right? We lay them out in a sort of graph, and we examine the words between them. And then sometimes maybe we can find overlapping fragments that helps, add stuff to the books. A lot of the time you'll have a lot of copies of, let's say, the author's most important work.
Yeah.
And so from that, if there are many copies of a manuscript, you can actually pick out where errors were introduced over time. You go to the older ones, you compare them with the newer ones, and if it's if you have several instances of each and the error is repeated, you can see, it was introduced at this time period, So it's a tricky process. As far as the attribution is concerned, because I think that was also part of your question, how do we really know who wrote this? It's the name on the page, often, is how we work that out. Sometimes there's other historian books that will kind of corroborate. They might say there was this person in this city at this time and they were talking about these things. And then we have a manuscript that claims it's from that person, and it seems to be kind of talking about the same things. So that helps. But anyways, there's a whole bunch of methods. Like, this is a whole field of study, of course, especially around scriptures and ancient works in general.
Yeah, any sort of ancient text is going to be a whole ball of wax.
Yeah.
It's something I did some thinking on when I thought about, okay, all we have are fragments.
Mm-hmm.
So from a certain perspective, we don't even know what Heraclitus was saying. We don't know if somebody, like you said, spent 40 years thinking about it and then wrote down what they supposedly remembered him saying.
Yeah, or a synthesis of it. It could be that the verses that we read from Heraclitus was like one of his disciples codifying it.
No.
Making it a catechetical thing where they verbally repeat the verses in order to remember it. Well, we have no idea.
I mean, I do remember there being this study, like you said, about things being passed down orally. The oral memory of some of these ancient cultures was just profound. And that's something I think we neglect to remember. There are very few places left on Earth that I can think of. The last time I remember this in my own life was when I was very young. We were asked to memorize whole passages of things.
Yeah.
Whether it was a passage from the Hebrew scriptures or whether it was a passage from the Septuagint, what have you. And that's not something that people typically do.
Mm-hmm.
We were kind of the last holdout of what I would call an ancient oral tradition. But for some people, that's all they had for years. They
Absolutely.
didn't even have a text to read and memorize. They just had to have it memorized from father to son.
But to kind of connect this back into our overall narrative, right? Maybe this is a side plot or something, but
sure.
To connect it back, I think that this conversation or this topic puts another layer of skepticism on top of our epistemology. So if we, doubt the observation process, if we doubt the reasoning process, if we doubt the historical process, then there's just a compounding effect of skepticism growing there, and this is one of those components.
Absolutely, and I'm going to reference throughout this conversation texts from the Jewish philosophical work Ecclesiastes. There's a text in there that says, "There is no memory of former things." And when I remember reading that the first time, I was like, what do you mean there's no memory of former things? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Because we remember that Tiberius Caesar lived around this time period. We remember that Augustus lived around this time period.
Yeah.
Julius Caesar invaded Gaul around this time period. But in the sense of the postmodern idea of what it means to know something, I mean, yeah, we can't technically remember something in the way that we want to. I can't even remember it the way I remember waking up this morning. I don't remember what I did today. So who's to say we're going to remember? Did you find it?
Absolutely. No, I was just thinking of a theory that a Enlightenment philosopher came up with, but I couldn't remember its name. I still can't. It was like something about a murky ditch or something like that, effectively saying that there was a gap that was visibly impermeable between our current state and the things that are in the past. So it was a skeptic on history. It was, I believe it was pre-Hume, or it may have been Hume himself, because Hume was a well-known skeptic.
Yeah.
It wasn't Hume. Sorry. Anyways, he developed this theory, something ditch, maybe hazy. About history that said we can't really trust what we've been handed down in history. And this is kind of where we have the saying, history written by the victors, something like that.
Oh, yeah.
That's kind of where we have that, where it's like, the strongest people get to write those history books that we read and just take at face value.
And there's quotes from Nietzsche going through my mind right now. Those of you who've read Nietzsche probably know what I'm talking about. There's different morals for the lower people of society, supposedly the slaves, and different morals for the aristocratic members of society. And the most powerful people get to read and get to write the books. And that's the way academia worked for thousands of years, until you have the printing press and then the ability to disseminate this content. Then everybody's becoming a skeptic. Everybody's asking these questions.
It's tricky, too, because even with the distribution of information channels, you still have the issue of the homogeny of information sources.
Hmm.
And maybe that's tricky because what I'm saying is, even if there's a lot of channels in the current day to consume and process and then publish information, the sources from which they can consume are ultimately all limited in some way, right? And in effect, what I'm saying is that there's only so much information recorded in the actual time periods that we're interested in. And so if something's missing, literally everyone's wrong about it.
Yeah.
By nature of the correspondence theory, right? So because
correspondence theory of truth.
Of truth, yeah. Because what we're saying is, because we don't know about something, then our retelling of the story. I'm trying to be.
So you can't know what you don't know.
At the same time, it's hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't know what you don't know. So basically, if in history something happened and then we didn't record it, and let's assume it's important for the sake of this argument.
Sure.
Everybody's going to read the accounts in that time period and just not know about it. And so we'll be wrong about history, according to the correspondence theory of truth. So
here's where things get a little bit more difficult, because you can fast forward this point of view of written materials to the present. What do people take in on a daily basis? Most people aren't going out and reading the Apology by Xenophon about Socrates, or Individualism, Old and New, by John Dewey. Most people, what they read every day is the news. This was another thing that I considered. This might be a sidelight to the sidelight. Okay, here we go. I'm going to try to make this make sense.
I'm ready.
When coronavirus broke out, there was this narrative to the news. The general narrative was, we have a very big problem. That problem is, everybody could die from a pandemic if we are not very careful. The solution proposed was, everybody go into social distancing. There were different solutions and permutations of solutions. Mask, no mask, 6 feet, 12 feet, not aerosolized, lives on surfaces, sometimes it's not water droplets, oh it is. But then gradually coalescing out of this fragmentation, we're still on the first point, people. Out of these fragments of news sources, we have this narrative forming that everybody should be afraid.
Yeah.
Now I get up the past 3 days and I look at the very first page of my Chrome on Google. And I look at what Google wants to show me today.
Right.
For the past month and a half, it's been coronavirus. Now I'm seeing articles about how amazing Johnny Walker Blue is. I'm seeing articles about how amazing this cold front that's coming this weekend is going to be.
The weather, huh?
Yeah, I see articles on that. I see articles on, there was something else. Sports. I begin to see stuff about sports, and there's maybe one coronavirus thing at the very bottom.
Yeah.
And this coronavirus article is not a very panicky article. This article instead is saying something to the effect of, we might have overestimated how big of a deal this was. I don't remember the source. I believe it was CNN, because that's typically what pops up on my feed. So I began to consider, was there a story arc to the news cycle? And I thought maybe there is, because everything I'm seeing on the very front page, you consider this iPhone a newspaper, and when I open my Chrome in the mornings, that's the front page of the newspaper, and what does Chrome decide to put on the front page of their electronic newspaper? A bunch of stuff that is contradictory to what the scientists are supposedly saying, that this is still a dangerous thing, still supposedly dangerous to us. But for whatever reason, the heightened DEFCON level of emergency wasn't there. And I then questioned, was I being influenced?
Yeah.
The entire time this was going on. Was my personhood subject to suggestibility? That I was responding to the suggestibility of the narrative of the news, and now that the narrative is changing, I'm going to gradually feel better about going outside my house.
Yeah.
So that is a sidelight to the sidelight, and I was curious what you thought about that. It could be far-fetched, but we have all of these fragments coalescing into a narrative now.
It's tricky because there's so many layers of conspiracy theory. And I mean it in the literal sense. There are theories of conspiracies going on. And even what you're suggesting is a very surface level conspiracy theory. That is to say, that rather than, let's say, arbitrary supply and demand dictating your newsfeed, right? The articles that their algorithm determines you will actually read the most. Rather than that happening, which is maybe what they'd say, why your newsfeed changed dramatically in the last 3 days. They're like, well, you didn't click on those articles, so, or whatever. Rather than that being the case, you're suggesting that they have a sort of agenda to influence the population. Okay, so that's a surface level conspiracy theory. I have no idea who's listening to this, but I would warrant to guess that many of you are like, oh, of course that's true, obviously. And then many of you are probably like, how absurd. That's so silly of them to assume that these companies would be anything but capitalist. So, or maybe they are being capitalist, maybe it's incentivized. But regardless, oddly, I was exposed to layers and layers and layers deeper of conspiracy theory recently about this via my immediate family. So regardless about that, what I would say is I don't think that you are in error at all in considering these things. I think that it's good to think about it. It's good to think through it. It's good to think the implications of it. And furthermore, of course you're being influenced. Now, is there human intentionality behind that? Right, that's where our minds go and consider.
Yeah.
That's kind of irrelevant. I think.
The point is that we're suggestible, and
The point is that your behavior's changing.
Countrywide, worldwide, we were suggested that some stuff was going on, and stuff really is going on. It is dangerous. But what happens if the algorithm, even if it's just based upon the fact that I searched about whiskey 4 weeks ago, decides to show me a bunch of stuff on whiskey and not stuff about the coronavirus, and then if I'm an idiot, I decide that the threat is lower.
Right.
Now, my wife is a nurse. I don't think I'm going to do that. But suggestibility-wise, anybody else who isn't going to think these things through might just decide, okay, it's fine if I don't wear a mask when I go to Walmart.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I have other thoughts there. But that word suggestibility, I think, will come up again. And this goes into advertising and marketing and bending a culture of disparate people into one stream.
Yeah.
And the reason I thought that was connected to Heraclitus is because just like we can't necessarily know about the past, I'm not going to say we can't know anything about the present, but how much can we know? How much can we know about current events even? If we're not there as a journalist, even when we're there as a journalist,
right.
I mean, we could just really dig this hole as deep as we want until we just decide, you know what, we are dumber than a bag of rocks. But
so I think, again, to kind of go back to what we've been talking about, maybe the first episode of our book club, is this concept of observation, how much, first and second episodes, I suppose, how much can you trust it? And I have to answer the same way. We ultimately rely on, in practice, we rely on a multitude of witnesses. And so if you're a journalist and you see something, you're going to observe it and you're going to report one way. Now, a different journalist is going to see it. They might report a little bit differently. They might report a lot differently if there's agendas going on. But regardless, there should be some overlap in the reporting there. And so the multitude, as this, journalist from 1 to 100 will say, write their articles and you read them, the amount of overlap there, or maybe the subset of commonalities that you find will, and again, I'm speaking practically, like in reality, this is how science
if there is something going on, then everybody will assert that there's the same thing generally is going on. Okay.
And so that's just practically speaking how we trust stuff, to answer the question.
Sure.
But you kind of were pointing at something of how philosophically sound is this? And I just have to say, not at all. Like, fundamentally, this is not a sound method. And I think that that's well accepted within philosophy, more or less well accepted in philosophy, that even the scientific method, so-called, isn't well accepted. especially the version that is taught in high schools and community colleges. I mean, you throw that out the window when it comes to reality.
And that's what just blew my mind this week, because for years I have been taught the simple list of steps.
Yeah.
You observe, or no, I think it's hypotheses first. You think something might be so, you go and observe, you enact an experiment on it to see if you can get it knowledge a posteriori.
Yeah.
Instead of reason about it. And that's supposedly what it was.
And then, if it's repeated everywhere and sufficiently by enough groups of people and all that, maybe it could be a theory someday.
So why is there such a disparity then? This is one of the many questions that came to mind as this knowledge came to me from the Mindscape podcast by Sean Carroll. Thank you for an excellent podcast, Sean Carroll. The question that came to me is, why is there this disparity between community college and high school education and the way it's been taught, obviously for good reason to the people who put it in place, between that and whatever the community of higher up elites say it should be?
What do you mean by good reason?
I mean, I assume that because it was that way for so long, they believed that they were doing it for a good reason. I like to see the positive in the people who've built the educational system, but why is there that disparity then between the scientific community and what's taught?
My immediate reaction is to say the cause or the effect of this teaching is for us to have a generally higher level of trust for science in general. And then furthermore, it's sort of a dumbed down thing. I don't know that it needs to be dumbed down, but I also don't know that most of the stuff that's dumbed down in public schools and community colleges needs to be. So I think it's about on that same level of granularity of difficulty, where it's comprehensible by the masses and thereby is kind of eligible to be taught in these levels. Maybe
it's even deeper than that, though. And, this is an aesthetic example, but I remember at the very end of Johann Strauss's Thus Spake Zarathustra, the musical work.
Yeah.
It's a tone poem, and the tonality of B major represents science, and the tonality of C major represents nature. And
I didn't know that.
The end of it is C major, B major.
Yeah.
Incongruous, dissonant, not in sync.
But also beautiful given the context. Somehow it works
out. Beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a beautiful ending. It's mysterious.
I'm just thinking of 2001: A Space Odyssey right now.
But then, I know, great movie. But then you listen to that and you think of the tonal dissonance that the hearers would have thought, and they're looking at their program, sitting in this great concert of program music, and they hear the dissonance, and they know that one represents science, one represents nature, and they think, okay, this is in the middle of, or the cusp of modernism, maybe not the middle of modernism, but on the cusp of modernism.
Sure.
Like, why is there incongruity between science and nature? Why can't it be simplified?
Yeah. That's actually really enlightening, to be a bit punny. But good grief. Like, that is really interesting that's science and nature being...
And that's interesting because you think science is the thing we use to plumb nature's depths.
In an ideal world, yeah.
But nature continues to defy us.
Yeah. I think that's what he's getting at, right?
The poetic nature of nature still holds true.
That's great.
And, this is what was interesting is the London School of Economics fellow that was interviewed on the Sean Carroll Mindscape podcast. His name, for the record, Liam Kofi. Excellent guy, very intelligent. Who he listed as a better idea for the Baconian idea that we've all been taught of these amazing simple steps that will supposedly help us plumb the depths of nature. An alternative was John Dewey. So I open up John Dewey this week because I happen to have a book of his on my bookshelf, and I say, okay, maybe I can figure something out here. And this book that he wrote is called Individualism, Old and New. The reason I felt this was apropos is because the London School of Economics fellow, Liam Kofi, mentioned how this process of science needs to be more individual. He says the student in the high school needs to be given a problem and then asked to enact scientific experiments or formulae to solve that problem. So we thought, okay, individualism is the answer.
It's almost like they're just given the ingredients to solve it, or maybe even not, if you really take this method to its extreme, and then are told, okay, go and figure it out,
And that's just insane to me, because I thought science worked best within a community.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing these contradictions everywhere, and I open up this book and read it, and I attempt to find how this system is better than what we have.
Right. Or what we've been taught, right?
Yeah.
This is probably a better reflection of what is in reality. But anyways, what did you find?
I didn't find that there was any improvement from a certain point of view. I was left with more questions than answers, more confusion than answers, and I think that this first paragraph or so really sums it up. This is John Dewey, first page, first paragraph, quote, "It is becoming a commonplace to say that in thought and feeling, or at least in the language in which they are expressed, we are living in some bygone century, anywhere from the 13th to the 18th, although physically and externally we belong to the 20th century. In such a contradictory condition, it is not surprising that a report of American life, such as is contained, for example, in Middletown, should frequently refer to a bewildered or confused state of mind as characteristic of us." Unquote. So, that might, see the quizzical look on your face, might leave you with more questions than answers. Well, he's talking about a general feeling in society, a general bewilderment, a general confusion.
Yeah.
And the one thing that we were taught we could hold on to was science.
Right.
So then when that is gone, how do we plumb nature's depths? Can we even do it? That's what we've been talking about the past 4 episodes.
Yeah.
Can't trust our own observation. So he then goes on, quote, "Anthropologically speaking, we are living in a money culture. Its cult and rites dominate. The money medium of exchange and the cluster of activities associated with its acquisition drastically condition the other activities of the people. This, of course, is as it should be. People have to make a living, do they not? And for what should they work if not for money? And how should they get goods and enjoyments if not by buying them with money, thus enabling someone else to make more money and in the end to start shops and factories to give employment to still others, so that they can make more money, to enable other people to make more money by selling goods, and so on indefinitely. So far, all is for the best in the best of all possible cultures. Our rugged, or is it ragged, individualism." When it comes down to this individualism, people see all of these questions that science was supposed to answer. Sean Carroll and Liam Kofi, great people, come along, throw more questions and quandaries into it. And then the alternative is forget about it, don't think about any of it, and just go on your way with commerce.
Wow, that's really interesting. Because I think that's what's going on.
Yeah.
That's almost the theme of postmodernism.
Yeah.
And to further that, it's like the postmodern movement here is distrusting. It's not like it's just distrusting this method. It's almost like it distrusts all methods. We see this in my circles in Christianity by the further, I guess, disinterest that people have in apologetics. The younger generations just don't really care about apologetical arguments. For instance, we have a long, seemingly growing list of quote-unquote proofs for the existence of a deity. Literally no one cares anymore. Yeah. That might have convinced someone in like the 16th century or something.
Their brains aren't conditioned to accept a rash argument and a rational proof, and that was something else that was coming to mind. This whole knowledge question, quote unquote, whatever that is.
Yeah.
If we can't know anything about the past because there's so many fragments and we bring them all together, we can't know anything about the present because it's a bunch of people who might or might not be influencing me.
Yeah, or deceiving, and
And how can we know anything about the thing that for thousands of years has been the most foremost question on human minds, the nature of the divine? That's the most at the very top of the list. We can't know basic things. So how can we know anything about that? That was something that
Yeah.
Theologically, that's just a theologically devastating question to me.
It's tricky, right?
Yeah.
And there's a plethora of answers, frankly. Perhaps a couple episodes and sidelights later, we'll get to them.
For now,
Yeah.
folks, you will have to keep listening. But when you think these questions through, you can see where this line of reasoning goes. The rabbit hole of skepticism is a deep, dark singularity from which no light escapes. And, that used to be very depressing for people like me and Jacob, but we've been conditioned to climb down that hole, so now
I smile at it, honestly.
We smile at the
Like,
rabbit hole.
my skepticism. You're my friend.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Well, I will say that...
Anything else to wrap up this Sidelights, our first Sidelights
Oh,
episode?
I've got many more quotes I want to share with you from
sure.
Dewey. I'm just wanting to make sure I find it.
Dewey sounds like a bit of a skeptic himself.
Indeed. Quote, with an enormous command of instrumentalities, with possession of a secure technology, we glorify the past and legalize and idealize the status quo, instead of seriously asking how we are to employ the means at our disposal so as to form an equitable and stable society. Our tradition, our heritage, is itself double. It contains in itself the ideal of equality of opportunity and of freedom for all, without regard to birth and status as a condition for the effective realization of that equality. But it's a promise of a new moral and religious outlook has not been attained. It has not become the wellspring of a new intellectual consensus. It is not, even unconsciously, the vital source of any distinctive and shared philosophy. What do you get out of that?
See, what he's getting at is the philosophical emptiness of our modern progress. I think that's right. He's saying, sure, economic wealth, privilege, rights, okay, but so what? Have we really improved?
Yeah. And that's an endless discussion. And there was a podcast episode I listened to a while back that just talked about decadence and how we almost get bored with our progress and then want to figure out something new.
Yeah.
And this brings us to the great meta question, why? Why discuss any of this? Why do philosophy? Why do science?
Mm-hmm.
Some would call the scientific exploits of man an ancillary spirit of his ability and desire to propagate himself into the future. Would we agree on that?
Some would say. Yeah, absolutely.
And even further, the desire to propagate oneself into the future often comes out of a fear of demise or death. Would we agree to that?
Oh,
premise?
yeah.
Okay. So then, when you then connect this to philosophy is understanding all of the goods and bads of doing that, propagating oneself into the future, on and on and on. Could we agree with that?
I think so.
For the sake of argument, perhaps.
Yeah, for the sake of argument. See, we're not really talking about philosophy strictly. We're more talking about the purpose from which we engage in philosophy.
Yes.
So it's a little bit harder to say, I guess. But yes, I think that the meaning is there, the right way to proceed in living. And, I mean, that's Socratic when it comes down to it. It's a Socratic definition of philosophy.
And the reason I feel philosophy gives us almost the impetus to engage in science, because we realize the more philosophical we become that we're going to die. We realize the end is near. And that results in all of this action to propagate human flourishing into the future, to somehow get to the place where humanity is stable. Lives can last longer. Humanity's progress can constantly go forward, and our souls may perhaps even not have to leave the body at some point.
But from a individual standpoint, it's almost like you're saying, at the end of life, you want to be able to look back on your life and have some feeling of, oh, I did something. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
I could definitely agree with that. But what do you think death puts on all of these actions?
Death
Yeah.
brings down the heaviest of hammers.
Yeah. Well said. That was poetically said. That was very good.
Like, in all seriousness, I've said this for years now. If there's even a chance of a eternal something after life, then it's worth spending all of your finite time in life pursuing it, figuring it out, improving it by even a minute percentage. Because it's a finite amount of time as compared to an infinite amount of time.
Yeah, and that's where I hear the words of the Jewish philosopher in Latin, vanitas vanitatum. Vanity of vanities.
Yeah.
Because all of this striving after of when that we've done these past 5 episodes, and I'm not saying that as a derogatory statement.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But I am saying that it feels like we have been pouring water in a bucket.
Yeah.
And that bucket has holes in it, and it's constantly been draining itself.
The etymology actually is even maybe a better imagery. Hevel, being the Hebrew word there for vanity, effectively means like a breath, a vapor. It's sometimes translated. Even.
Shortness.
It's like you breathe, and even across this table, my breath doesn't reach you. You know, it's like I breathed out. Okay, it's over. You know, it's gone. It's done. That happened. You know, you just are expending a minute nothingness. So, when I say death is just the ultimate end all, what I'm getting at is even at the end of your life, if you want to look back and say, "Oh, I did all these great things," death quashes that. Like, even those supposed good things that you did with life, death doesn't care. And you won't care after you die. Whether that's nullness or whether it's any sort of eternal thing, you're not going to care about what you did in a finite amount of time if you have an infinite amount of time.
There is no remembrance of former things.
Yeah.
And that was the next assertion I was going to make in this train of thought for you to see what you thought about this, is that perhaps the collective intelligence of our society is coming to the point of vanitas vanitatum, nihilism, skepticism, whatever you want to call it. I throw all of those things in the same bucket. Whether that's right or not, all of the feelings that are produced purportedly from those 3 things tend to be similar.
Yeah.
So because of that, I feel that you can logically put them all in the same bucket, even though definitionally they might not work all the way.
Yeah, that's okay.
But right before the writer of Ecclesiastes, the Jewish philosopher, comes to the point of nihilism, or vanitas, vanity of vanities, he then undergoes all of these explorations. He tries pleasure. He tries wisdom. He tries all of these things. But at the very end, he's like, all of these were nothing. And that's really the only thing I would close on this discussion about knowing and what we can know, is that I feel the only place it can go when it comes to knowledge is getting to the point where we say we can know nothing. And that's a very depressing, nihilistic point of view.
Wow.
And there are so many ways out of nihilism. And that was my next question, to hand it off to you.
Sure.
How do you think people deal with the knowledge that they're going to die, and also the nihilism that comes from that?
They deal with it in various ways, of course. But historically speaking, the most common way that we know of is to think about a eternal afterlife. If you look at any culture, any given culture, they have some sort of religious structure by which they can achieve a positive religious afterlife.
Let's make it hit home. How do you think our present culture will respond to the threat of death imposed upon them by coronavirus?
That's tricky. After every natural disaster, there's a resurgence in church attendance. So,
And see, that's what I thought.
to
right?
go back to
That's what I thought.
the Jewish philosopher you keep referring to, the mind of the wise is in the house of mourning.
No.
So what's going on there? It's because mourning, the act of seeing someone die and being sad about it, and mourning through that, makes you think about your own finiteness.
Mm.
So, and how do we deal with our own finiteness? By relying on supernatural things.
Some would assert, but see, here's the thing. There are many other ways to deal with that. I mean, there's the poetic way, shout into the void. Now, what you said earlier, that shout is just a little breath.
Yes, it is a breath.
But the poet says, shout into the void while you may. It says,
Yeah.
gather ye rosebuds while you may, because the day ends soon. You know, carpe diem, seize the day.
See, and that is the other answer, but ultimately...
What's the problem with that answer?
Well, they're staying in the bucket of nihilism that you're referring to.
But it could be an endless bucket of pleasure.
Until death happens. Right?
But then if science gives you enough solace to believe that there is nothing after death, then no problems at all. And that's exactly what I was thinking. I remember after 9/11 hit, we saw all of these things on CNN and MSNBC and every news thing, people lighting candles, praying in downtown New York. And I thought, what other reactions might people have to this? How might this fear of death affect people? And to supposedly suit our narrative that we have set aside for an episode, I'm going to relate this back to our episode so you understand how this relates.
Sure.
We were discussing at one point Socrates' view of death, and he has this very stoic facing of death. So I thought, okay, that's one way somebody can view death. Jacob, my amazing interlocutor here, mentioned another view of facing death, the religious view of facing death, and I mentioned another one, the pleasure-seeking facing of death. And I think there might be one more, but it's tough to really plumb out what might be there. But this has some parallels to the Jewish philosophy we've already been talking about.
Right.
We've already mentioned just wise stoicism. We've mentioned pleasure. But then there could be another one. That's the one I've never understood, is folly and madness. How does one live a life of folly and madness? Living in pleasure, as he mentions in Ecclesiastes, makes sense.
Yeah.
We can all do that.
Okay.
Living in wisdom. We've tried to do that, folks. As you can tell from this discussion and the way we beat about the bush, we have not succeeded as much as we wish. At least I haven't. Jacob perhaps has.
Oh.
But what I'm trying to say here is that it's like a finite set of options.
Oh, okay. I get that. I completely get that.
There's a finite set of options for how to face this
Yeah.
coming hammer blow.
I mean, the folly route is really interesting to me because
I have no idea what it is.
It's almost a recognition of the absolute futility of things that drives the person mad.
So maybe the person just says the nature of existence is absurd.
Yeah.
And moves on with their life.
And they behave absurdly, right?
I've never understood that. I guess that's the nature of it, because it's absurd.
That's my simple understanding, we'll say.
But it's so funny because you could almost class every single philosophical movement. This is going to be a massive assertion. I love making assertions. I'm going to make so many of you angry right now.
Categorizational error. Go ahead.
You could categorize every philosophical school, if you will, under something in Ecclesiastes. The wisdom and stoicism that is approached, that he digs into, and then he eventually gets to the end of the book and says, of the making of much books there is no end, and great study is a weariness of the flesh, is what he says.
Hurts my heart.
So there's that one, which hurts us because our entire thing is founded on study.
Why am I in school?
Then he gets to the next one and he says, pleasure, and we know where pleasure, there's Epicureanism. What other pleasure schools of philosophy are there? I can't think of any others.
Well, I'm not sure about philosophy specifically. Well, hedonism, I suppose you could call philosophy,
hedonism
right?
is a philosophy.
But anyways, regardless, there are a lot of pleasure-centric implications in various religions. And so, I mean, the one that comes to mind is the however many virgins you get at the end
72.
72, huh? Perpetual.
Wonder if they get bored up there. I mean,
Yeah, it's only 72, I suppose. Anyways, perpetual.
this is an amazing discussion.
That bit has always confused me. It's like, but why? But anyways, being a married man, I'm just so confused right now.
You can only do a certain subset of things, but we're gonna...
Yeah. All right.
So that basically is all I wanted to say about Socrates and the nature of death. I think folks were all facing, as Jacob said, this hammer blow.
You have to deal with it somehow, though, is kind of your point, right? And there's roughly 3 reactions.
Yeah, 3 or 4 at the most. There's a small plethora of reactions. You can say you've come up with a new reaction to the main question we're all considering. And even if you're not considering it, you are still reacting to that question.
Well, actually, what I was going to say is some people just try not to react, which that also falls into the category of the Stoicism, Socrates.
Stoicism / pleasure, perhaps.
/ wisdom, yeah. Basically, well, it's not even pleasure, right? So it's the people who spend their lives trying to improve the lives of everyone else, and they don't really think about their own death as any consequence or significance, because they'll supposedly be, a good person and be happy with that at the end of their days. So, anyways, that's kind of the Stoic wisdom as well.
The philosophical vanity to impose upon that assertion is that you believe that you will be judged based upon your actions, so you act well.
Or not judged at all, and
you have no way of proving that anything you do will be worth it.
Right.
You have no heuristic to prove that.
Right, because they don't have any philosophy of deity, they have no basis for even having an idea if that God will be pleased with their action or not. Yeah, it's tricky.
If there is a deity. But then on the other hand, they're probably doing the Pascalian route and saying, oh, well, if there isn't, we'll be okay anyway. But those are some of the things I've been thinking about. I'm sure you have things that have been on your mind as well that may or may not be related. The way this all left me, these 5 episodes have been very formational. I have more questions, but also...
This is our 4th, but that's okay.
4 or 5, yeah. 4 or 4. More questions, but more answers, I say.
Yeah, honestly, I agree completely. These episodes, our book club serves a purpose. It serves one purpose, and that is to think the thoughts of mankind after them, and to kind of paraphrase a famous saying and also one of our own sayings. And it fulfills that, because we're reading their words directly. We're going back to the original sources. We're finding value in that, and we're working out their reasoning. And thereby, we're adopting those reasoning processes as our own. But because we're reading so much of history and such a wide breadth, we weed out these reasoning processes, and these philosophies. So anyways, it's serving that purpose. But the purpose of this podcast, the philosophy podcast, is just to make sense of it all, to construct it into a narrative format, like we've mentioned before, so that we can go through history and try and glean some meaning from it. Like, many people have done this sort of project before, where they're like, what does history mean? That's what we're doing here. We're trying to figure out what it means.
And this is the point where I would ask there to be some sort of wager given between the two of us. Because I think I know what you would say to this question, I'm going to take the opposite side of the argument.
Fair.
I think we will get to the end of this and we will find an answer. I think as you know, I try to be an optimist. I try to say there is a method out there. There is a system or a pathway by which we may travel to improve ourselves. I mean, look at our modern world. We've cured polio almost entirely. We have a whole plethora of benefits that we've created, almost a heaven on earth. This world is beautiful, and there are so many beautiful things in it. You can't help but love what you see. So I'm going to argue over the course of this narrative in the future for the optimistic side.
Okay.
That there is perhaps an answer in the thoughts of mankind. You could call it a new theology, or you could call it philosophy, or you could call it stupidity. whatever you prefer to call
Or to
it.
go back to our first week, logos.
Yeah.
Or reason. Good reason.
Good reason. I would say there is a good reason for all of this. I'm going to argue
All right.
that there is no absurdity anywhere. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, that was an absurd statement.
Didn't last very long.
Oh, man.
So next week is the only other thing I'd like to mention. So it will be Plato's The Republic. And I'm just going to let a long pause be there because Plato's The Republic is such an immense work. It's fundamental to all philosophy after it. I think many people have said that. So
we might just study only that because there's so much on that one
our
thing.
book club also covered Thomas More's Utopia, although ironically it was barely mentioned when we actually met in book club.
Because anything Thomas More was saying, what we discovered was he was in that continuum where he was just saying stuff Plato had already said and possibly not as well.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even say he was saying stuff that Plato had already said. It was actually a little... So it was so, like, application specific, but it also rubbed us wrong, the writing style. Just, and the history around it. It's like, he's trying to say something that kind of gets under the skin of his government, but he's not really coming out and saying it, and it's confusing what he's actually meaning.
It was a governmental system that we can almost not even envision a monarchy where you could have your head chopped off and placed on the London Bridge for all to see.
I mean, the other thing I would say, we might as well talk about Utopia now, and then focus on the Republic,
idea.
Right? So the
That's
other thing I'd say about Utopia is it's really predicated on men's good nature being, like, really, really good.
Ooh.
And I reject that on the face of it.
Yeah.
Like, we can all just think about it. Are men good? How many lies have you heard today, do you think, this week? Could you estimate that? If you live in the world, if you work in a workforce, you're going to be exposed to maybe
badness.
Yeah, maybe you're naive and you don't like seeing it, or you're optimistic and you like to reason that people are trying to be utilitarian or whatever the case may be, by whatever moral theory you want. When it comes down to it, I think people aren't good inherently. I assert that.
Yeah. Anybody who wanted to argue to the other side of that argument has the 20th century as their great hammer blow.
That's right.
We have the hammer blow to human satisfaction, and we have the hammer blow to human self-satisfaction.
And in the history of philosophy, we see that, right? Because the modernist movement had this myth of utopia, like it's literally a term now, where they thought that science and progress and all of that, and there's other terms for it relating to the progress of history and all that, would bring them to an ever-increasing place of goodness and prosperity. And because of that, people wouldn't have reasons to lie, cheat, steal, or break any of the other 10 commandments. So what happened, though, philosophically and historically speaking, is you're right, the 20th century, the World Wars, all of that played into the bringing about of the end of modernism and the uptick in postmodernism. Like, we have modernist philosophy and we have postmodernist philosophy. And the 20th century is the main dividing point for that.
Yeah. And that basically sums up any ideas of utopia, and that's why Plato is still somewhat more apropos to human life, because I don't think he assumes on the infallible nature of goodness. And also his system has just such elegance to it, and it's not just related to utopia and political systems. It's related to so many other things.
It's philosophically low enough in its level, I guess you could say, that you can take it and consider it and apply it to a very wide variety of things. It actually, another book we might read in our book club sometime is Miyamoto Musashi's Book of Five Rings.
Yes.
One of my favorites. Ironically, I think it's a philosophy book more than anything, even though it's supposedly a sword fighting manual. because I read that book and I instantaneously, I mean overnight, I was playing League of Legends at the time. I remember this distinctly.
Perfect.
Like, I'm not even kidding. In college.
Were you watching anime while you did this too?
No, not a weeb, guys. I just played League a little bit. I was gold ranked. It's okay. I wasn't that good. Anyways, overnight I got better at this game, this stupid video game, because I read Miyamoto Musashi and adopted some of the methods with it.
Were you good at Age of Empires? Is this why you beat me all the time? Because of that?
That was pre
Five
Book of
Rings.
5 Rings, yeah.
Yeah. You had just keyloggers
Although
going.
I think I did have Sun Tzu on my shelf at that point, but man, what were we talking about?
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I try to give these cultural references to make it entertaining for the people. I try to give the people what they want and then just derail the conversation. Okay, failure.
Right.
You were talking about the Book of
The
Five
Republic,
Rings
right?
and the Republic. Yeah.
Yeah, the Republic and it's being philosophically low level. So anyways, we'll be talking about the Republic next week. We had some really good discussions about it in our book club. Stephen actually led that discussion, and we hope to have him as a guest on our podcast. So don't be alarmed if you hear a third voice.
It is not a ghost.
It is a very distinct voice as well, so you won't have any trouble identifying our newest member. So
Yeah, and he has some great thoughts. Any of you who love physics out there, stay tuned. He's got some stuff to share that you probably have never heard before
absolutely.
about the physical realms.
Yeah, his presentation that month. So for those of you who don't know, this is a great time to talk about the book club a little bit more. It's a Sidelights episode. We structure it such that a member of the book club gives a monologue, is what we call it, a presentation up front where they get to discuss and explore topics at their will. And it's an educational time for us all because one person gets to specialize in going deep and learning and synthesizing and teaching, and the other people get to the benefit of hearing that. And because it's such a small group, those teachings are targeted enough at the audience, which is the other members, to where everyone really gets something good and even unique out of that discussion. So anyways, that's the first phase of the book club. Then we go on to our critical thinking questions. I might be including some of these critical thinking questions at the end of some of our episodes, by the way.
Oh, good.
And I'll give a short introduction whenever that happens. Have a little post philosophy conversation there. But anyways, and then we kind of wrap up after that, have a more open discussion time. So Stephen should be on the next week to talk about the Republic with us.
Awesome. Well, folks, this has been the Positive Perspectives Philosophy Podcast. I'm Brandon Moore, and Jacob Murdoch is with us hosting. And we enjoyed talking about these questions. I hope that you consider the reason why we all philosophize, and I hope you'll come to realize that we're all secretly philosophers.
Yes.
Deep down somewhere.
Join the Philosophers Anonymous Club. Absolutely.
Nobody knows, but we all are. This has been PPPP, signing off.